Why, hello, WCA. Mike Amore, 4 p.m., Week 5 update. You guys talked me into letting you play from the following position. And we played this queenless middle game. And I saw an example. I'm going to show you the example from the Malcolm Rohan game. Welcome back, Malcolm, by the way. And they played a really good game with a lot of ideas. I'm going to quickly show you a game that I guess I can say I played it because I physically moved the pieces, but the ideas were given to me all by Grandmaster Lombardi from this very position. And he had taught me a lot of ideas that I got lucky in one game. My opponent let me execute every single one of them. So I basically went to move 14 without any thinking on my own. Let me show you that quickly, and then I'll show you what Malcolm and Rohan did, okay? So my opponent attacks the e-pawn, and here a very common way to defend this pawn when the knight attacks it is just play f6. And by playing f6, you create this beautiful chain of pawns. And when you do that, that gives you a positional idea of trading off this dark squared bishop. You can see that it's kind of blocked by these pawns, trading off this bishop for our opponent's very strong bishop up here. My partner played knight to c3, and then a pretty nice move. Now, I could put the bishop on c5. I know Rohan did that in the game, but here black plays the move c6, which stops the knight from penetrating and gives the king a wonderful square on c7. Bishop develops to c4, what could be more natural, and now a funny-looking move, knight to d7. The reason the knight is on d7, it looks like it's blocking the light square bishop. I mean, it is blocking the light square bishop. But the reason is it wants to cover the c5 square. Why? Well, white castled. Black put the king on c7, a very comfortable square for the king. And now we'll get to why this knight's on d7. Look at the white position. White has one last minor piece to develop, this bishop up here on c1. Well, it has two options, d2 or e3. If you put it on d2, you're going to have to explain to the rest of the pieces what the bishop is doing there, so it's very natural to put it on e3. Well, we're behind in development. We only have, like, is this even a whole piece out? Or does black just have half a piece out? 4 minor pieces for white to like a half. So we need to catch up. Bishop c5. And now you see why the knight's on d7. He took, we take with the knight, and now an interesting moment, pawn to b4. Since we're still behind in development, we don't move the knight. So what do? What? We don't move the knight? Are we going to lose a knight? No. We challenge our opponent's bishop. And it would not be a good idea for white to take this knight, because if they did, you would take the bishop here on c4. And if you look at this position, black has the only long-range piece left, minor piece, and I think this endgame is going to be pretty good for black, especially since all of these pawns on the queen side have been chopped up. So with the bishops kind of facing off with each other, the only other good alternative might be to put the bishop on b3. At least here, if black wants to keep the only bishop in the game, you'd have to trade your knight for that bishop, and that would open up the A file for the rook, and you now have a second B pawn, which could be used to weaken or soften up the black king over here. So that's a reasonable idea. But in the game, my opponent just took my bishop. I took back, and he immediately goes to dominate the only open file. Well, here's another positional trick. If you see that you can keep both rooks off an open file, now right now there's only one. See him up here? Only one. If there's two and they line up, and that means they can come in, especially to the squares that only the king protects. But if you can look ahead and know that you can keep both rooks off that file, then it's not a bad idea to create a second pawn wedge. Why? I'll show you in a minute. My opponent wants to double rooks. He plays rook d2. We develop our last minor piece, and he threatens to win that piece with rook to d7. What do? we challenge the rook. With which one of our rooks? The A rook or the H rook? Keep in mind you just created a second wedge. Correct. The H rook. H to D8. If he takes, you do not take with the rook. You take with the knight because you want this rook on A8 to support your break. So he didn't take. He wants to move his king closer to the center because he realizes this is quickly turning into an endgame, so he doesn't want to get checked by this knight here, so he plays the move king f1. Now, you'll see what I mean in a moment about that check. We immediately trade a pair of rooks. By the way, he could have taken with a knight instead of the rook and maybe hopped the knight into these squares. You see that idea? But he just kind of like, let's keep the rook on the open file. But if you look at the penetration squares, the rook cannot get in. So then we head for our next spot. This knight's going to come here. I'm hesitating because I have another game in my head, and it reminds me of it. Isn't that funny how chess is? You're thinking of one game and another pops into your head. Good thing I'm not flying a plane. So the knight goes backwards to c8. Do you see why? Yeah, it's going to make that same hop that white could have done. So now the king wants to come up for white, and he doesn't want to get checked. So he plays g3. We hop our knight in. King goes to e2. There's the break. He protects the pawn. We take it, and all of a sudden the black rook is better than the white rook. Isn't that amazing that the white rook has been on an open file for so long, yet the black rook, which hasn't moved yet, is already controlling a lot of key squares on the A file. Knight jumps into c4, attacking the rook. Rook goes to d3. Knight b2, just to kind of feel out where the rook's going to go, and white loses the game in one move. Rook e3. Pause your video. Black to play and win. Okay. Knight d4 check. Bad news. The knight cannot be taken because you take back with the pawn forking. So the king moved out of check. You attack the rook. The rook moves. You simply trade the knight. Rook takes back. Do you see the continuation? Yeah, it's worse than the fork. Knight fork. King out. Take the rook. King takes. And what do we do? Yep, game over. Okay? I will list all of the ideas that I mentioned in this video in the blog so that you can kind of look for them before or after you watch the video. Let's take a look at Malcolm and Rohan. So instead of knight f3, Malcolm played bishop c4, which is a great move in this position. And Rohan creates the same pawn structure that I showed you. And here I love Malcolm's move. He plays knight e2, not f3. I think he realized from f3 it would have a hard time working with this structure. And also from e2, you see the idea of the f-pawn breaking right away, or at least at some point, which will give you a very, very different look than what happened in my game. So after knight e2, Rohan plays c6. You see how these ideas repeat? I was very impressed. You guys played really, really well. Malcolm castles. Okay. And now Rohan decides to put the bishop on c5 right away. Knight b to c3, king to c7, and now a3. And this is a very, very important moment in the game. Once a3 is played, I think black should ask what my opponent is trying to do next. Because I like Rohan's move. He developed a piece, maybe thinking that the bishop can come here again or something, but he got hit with the move b4, which pushed him back a little bit. So let's say you wanted to maintain that this bishop here on c5, then I think everyone in the class is familiar with these moves like a5, which simply secures this bishop to this square c5. It's very hard to kick the knight out, or a bishop, whatever's sitting there. This pawn move a5 does a nice job keeping it out. But instead, Rohan played knight d7 and he got kicked. And now the bishop is clearly less effective on d6, and then Malcolm takes the file. Knight to b6, and already white is securing an advantage. It goes to b3, but in this case, isn't it funny how so many of these ideas repeated between my game and their game? Remember the idea of the bishop on b3? But in that case, at least black could take this bishop off, even though they were giving white a file. Here, this bishop is just dominating the a2, g8 diagonal. It's a very, very strong piece. And now Rohan kind of plays bishop to d7, and it looks like black is getting tied up. Malcolm develops his dark square bishop, and then I like Rohan's move. He plays knight h6, tempting the bishop that just moved to trade itself for the knight, breaking the pawns. And I think Rohan was shooting to play with the two bishops. But Malcolm decides to take this knight, which I thought gave black, whatever advantage white had kind of disappeared after this move, because after the take back, Rohan gets the open H file. But he had an idea. He gets rid of the knight, and then he starts the doubling process. Just like in my game, rook H to D8. Really a cool game, guys. Rook A to D1. There's the two dangerous rooks on the open file, but you have to be careful. There are some tactics here. He moves the bishop out of the way to protect. Knight A4. And here I think Rohan should strike with B5. Because if the knight comes into C5, there are some tactics. Can you guys see it? You just take the knight, and even if the rooks come off the board, there's the in-between move, bishop takes f2 check, and you're going to pick up a pawn in this position. Then you get the rook, and I think black's doing really, really well here. So after knight a4, I think Rohan should immediately push to play that position. He played bishop to g6 instead, putting some pressure on this pawn. We have knight e to c3. And again, that b5 move should really be coming at this point. It's the same idea I showed you guys before. He plays f5. Okay, and now, can we go for tricks with knight takes b6, deflecting the king? You can work this stuff out at home, but he closes the position instead with the move f3, and Rohan plays f4. And here, he's getting in trouble by closing off these bishops, because now Malcolm finds knight takes pawn, deflecting the king. Rohan takes on a3, and here Malcolm missed a winning move. Can you guys spot it? It's amazing how the tactics just fly in these positions, keeping in mind that rooks really don't belong in boxes. Just knight to c4, and things are getting attacked everywhere. So I think that would have been a pretty cool move, but instead this knight came to trap the rook in, and Malcolm has a sneaky idea coming, so he's still playing pretty well. But after b5, I don't know how much is really on the board, and Malcolm just goes backwards, and it's like a pendulum. It keeps swinging to the left and to the right, and I think that Rohan is kind of back in the game, but he blunders here. And he plays the move bishop to f7, and that's a losing move. But very well played. I was very impressed. And I'm going to leave the video here. Do you want to see why it's a losing move, or can you figure it out? Yep. Here, let me turn on a highlight. You guys see that highlight? Oh, boy, there's a bishop and a knight in the way. Otherwise, you just take a free rook. So how do we make that work? Yeah, Malcolm just took on f7, and that's going to win. I think black, I don't know what black does if they have to take the knight here, but whatever, they're in trouble. But if you take this back straight away, you get hit with knight takes b5, and this is curtains for black. Anyway, wonderful job. Whatever it is you guys are doing at home, keep it up, because your games in the class are really good. I'll see you on Sunday.